research shows, and we're seeing it every time we go to the ACR, every time we go to EULAR, we're seeing the word remission, and we're like, what? And remission is happening to the people who are getting the diagnosis early, who are getting the treatments early, which is why this is so important. But that's not the norm. It's not the norm. And too often we get a detour on our road. That is one of these main issues of why we're not getting diagnosed. So Danielle, why don't you talk a little bit about that point?
So I think that really breaks into two parts. First of all, as a patient, you have to know that you need help. And for me, that was a huge hurdle. And at the beginning of my journey, I was a kid. I didn't know anything. But even if you just limit it to when I was an adult and I was going to see my own doctors, you only have ever existed in your body. You don't know what other people's reality is like. So I thought everybody had chronic pain. I thought everybody was tired all the time. I thought everybody had random fevers that popped up out of nowhere. Like, I didn't know that was unusual. That was the first thing. And then when I did start asking for help, my doctors would go, oh, there's something wrong with your shoulder, go see an orthopedist. There's something wrong with your knee, go see an orthopedist. Nobody sent me to a rheumatologist for years and years and years. And in point of fact, when I did finally end up at a rheumatologist, it's because a radiologist came back and said, look, I pulled this patient's MRIs for the last 3 years, and I think this is RA. And that's when an orthopedist finally sent me to a rheumatologist. So even just recognizing that I needed to see one was a huge problem.
That's
and then the other,
go ahead.
Sorry. And then the other part of it is once you know that you need to see a doctor and you're sitting in front of one, getting them to listen to you can be a huge problem. You know, most of the people who take a long time to get diagnosed, like you guys, have seronegative versions of things. And I know we're going to talk about blood work here in a bit. That wasn't me. When they did finally test my blood, I had rheumatoid factor positive. I was ACPA positive. I mean, my blood work was screaming, this person has a rheumatic disease, but nobody ever tested it that whole time. So we know that some members of the medical community have bias that they're not aware of, and they tend to downplay women's pain. And like 90% of people with rheumatic disease are women.
Research has shown, Danielle, you mentioned you were at ACPA positive, rheumatoid factor positive. You don't need those to have rheumatoid, even though it's in the name. You don't have to have those to have. People can have rheumatoid factor positive and not have any of our diseases. It's a blood marker. In saying that, people with our diseases that do have these markers have typically worser outcomes, meaning they have more aggressive disease. They might be more difficult to treat. They might just have worser flares, that type of thing. And so that's also swinging back why I realized in the beginning, undifferentiated at sometimes, not always, sometimes it is a question mark, but also other times it can mean that you have milder onset, which if you snip it and you get treatment for it, that is actually could be a good thing. In my journey, undifferentiated why, Carrie, I feel that I thought it was a bad thing was because they told me, similar to what you were told, I can't treat you, is what they told me. I can't treat you until I can figure out what this grows into, what this becomes, a full-fledged disease. So they were basically telling me, you don't actually have something. You have something that is not treatable. But once I got educated, I went back and realized there was treatment guidelines, not great ones, but there were guidelines that said I should have been treated with some mild disease modifying agent. And I was denied that. And guess what? I got worse. Things got worse, a lot worse. And I do look back a lot today and say, I wonder if there were people like Danielle, like you, Carrie, like me, like a lot of us here at AiArthritis, like the people that you were just at the conference with, Carrie, our friends, the people we talked to, if we could unite and create some kind of guide, some kind of navigation, something for these people who are coming into AI arthritis and saying, I don't have answers. We've got to start somewhere. And I feel like, why not start with the people who are the experts, right? And that is us. All right, I'm going to turn this back over. We're looking at the outline here. Danielle, what do you specifically still want to put on the table here as a point that we talked about that we would bring up and we haven't gotten to yet?
One of the things I think it's really important for everybody who is still searching for a diagnosis to understand is that your blood work is not like a blueprint to your body. It's not something that's static. It changes all the time. It is one snapshot in time. I have tracked my markers now because my rheumatologist keeps changing my diagnosis every time I turn around for several years. I have had times where my rheumatoid factor was barely positive. I've had times where it was very positive. I've had times where my ACPA was off the charts. I've had times where it was fairly moderate. If you look at SED rate, which is a sort of a generic marker that indicates how much inflammation is in your body, but a lot of doctors put a ton of weight on that. I have had times where it was normal. I have had times where it was 110 and normal is like less than 10. The pathology report that I got back that time said, evaluate this patient for cancer, because that's like those levels usually indicate something really, really bad. So just because you get back negative blood work doesn't necessarily mean even that you're seronegative. It may just mean you didn't have positive markers that day. Now, obviously, if you've had multiple tests and they're still negative, that also doesn't mean that you don't have one of these diseases. But I think it's really important for everybody to know that one test doesn't prove anything. It doesn't disprove anything.